Alright, and so we're back with another video here. I addressed already Pinky Sue's comment last time here. Did America have a secret service back in 1865? My response was, yup. And she asked me once again, where were they when Lincoln was killed? My response was, a lot of information. Make sure you check out my latest video, Rome the Great Whole Puppet Masters Beyond the CIA. I addressed your comments. So Pinky, if you haven't checked it out, make sure you do check it out. I'm going to address your comment once again. I figured, why not read from Vatican Assassins? So let's dig in. The Jesuits in 1865. Once again, Eric John Phelps, Vatican Assassins. Assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Supreme Jesuitism and subordinate Freemasonry work together. Assassins Jesuit Bernardine F. Widget. Masonic President Andrew Johnson. Masonic Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. Jesuits are good haters. Those who are not for them are against them and are treated correspondingly. It makes no difference if a man is a Catholic, a priest, a bishop, or even pope, evidenced by the hundreds of liberal Roman Catholic priests murdered by the Jesuit in their Nazi/SS controlled concentration camps, not to mention the public trial and killing one of their own professed brethren. Anti-middle-class communist Jesuit priest Alfred Delp, in maintaining the international illusion that the society was against Pope Pius XII's Jesuit-led Third Reich. Indeed, the more influential and orthodox the opponent, the greater the obligation to be on the Jesuit side. And if he ain't, as was Kaiser Wilhelm II, so much the greater justification for hating him. Karl Paul von Hunsbrock, 1911, German noble and ex-Jesuit, 14 years a Jesuit. I'm so glad to meet you again, he said. You see that your friends, the Jesuits, have not yet killed me, but they would have surely done it when I passed through their most devoted city, Baltimore. Had I not defeated their plans by passing incognito a few hours before they expected me. New projects of assassination are detected almost every day, accompanied with such savage circumstances that they bring to my memory the massacre of St. Bartholomew and the gunpowder plot. We feel at their investigation that they come from the same masters in the art of murder, the Jesuits. So many plots have already been made against my life that it is a real miracle that they have all failed, when we consider that the great majority of them were in the hands of skillful Roman Catholic murderers, evidently trained by the Jesuits. Abraham Lincoln, 1864. 20 men had been hired in Baltimore to assassinate the president-elect on his way to Washington. The leader of this band was an Italian Roman Catholic refugee, a barber well known in Baltimore. Their plan was as follows. When Mr. Lincoln had arrived in that city, the assassins were to mix the crowd and get as near his person as possible and shoot him with their pistols. If he was in a carriage, hand grenades had been prepared, filled with detonating powder, such as later guillotined Felice Orsini used in attempting to assassinate the orders most obedient Louis Napoleon and the orders anarchists would use in the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. These were to be thrown into the carriage, and to make the work of death doubly sure, pistols were to be discharged into the vehicle at the same moment. The assassins had a vessel lying ready to receive them in the harbor. From thence they would be carried to Mobile in the seceded state of Alabama. John Smith died, 1866. American historian. Let us strive to combine the calmness of reason with the fire of enthusiasm. Let us therefore become perfect in the art of loading the proud and the powerful with chains. Let us lay to heart this maxim as a rule of all our efforts. One sole authority, that of Rome. One sole order, that of the Jesuits. And since our age does not boast of a single mind capable of aspiring to universal empire, let it be ours to aim thus high, whilst empty heads are dreaming. Let not any opportunity escape us of observing what are man's tendencies. The better we know them, the more useful they will be as instruments in our hands. Let us at all events so conduct ourselves that our future glory may compensate for our present abasement. Whether our name be destined to perish or finally to prevail over kings and nations, let it at least be synonymous with the loftiest reach of greatness and daring which the world has ever seen or ever will see. When future generations read our story and learn what we have been, let them be forced to assimilate us, not with mankind, but with those cosmic agencies which Satan only puts in motion when it is his pleasure to charge the laws of the universe. Jesuit General Aloysius Fortis, 1825. It will be an error to suppose that the decrees of the Council of 1869-70, Vatican I, stood by themselves in a history of the papacy as a sudden manifestation of Jesuit supremacy. On the contrary, in the encyclical, which contains the syllabus of propositions condemned by the papacy, the syllabus of errors in 1864, 1 year prior to Lincoln's assassination, the Pope declares that the condemnation of these 80 propositions forms a summary of the policy of his pontificate, and this is true as respects the conduct he has pursued since his flight to Gaeta from Republican Rome in 1848 and his final subordination to Jesuit direction, which appears to have been consummated at that period. Perhaps our readers may wish to know at a glance what the syllabus is. The syllabus consists of some 80 propositions on religion, politics, and morality, every one which is now to be held by devout Roman Catholics as condemned by an infallible authority, which is as binding on their consciences as are the doctrines of the Bible on the consciences of others. The syllabus treats the papal authority as supreme, that no country may be deceived, that no sovereign be left ignorant. Here, given in full detail, is the declared judgment of him who is sovereign, ruler of millions of minds. First, to his rules and laws, all the nations of the world must bow. Second, all sovereigns hold their thrones. All people pay their allegiance on condition that they believe the Creed of Rome and practice its worship. There is no religion but that of Rome, and no other faith is to be held or allowed. Liberty of conscience is prohibited. Toleration of other religions is a crime against society. All sovereigns or Protestants are heretics, and heresy is a crime for which they ought to be deposed. All free thought and free speech on religion are criminal. The liberty of the press and of worship are to be put down. This is the creed, and where it has the power to practice of Rome. It is impossible to conceive of a document more deeply fraught with the essence of despotism. Unnamed author, 1872. The organization of the hierarchy is a complete military despotism, of which the Pope is the ostensible head, but of which the Black Pope is the real head. The Black Pope is the head of the order of the Jesuits and is called a general. He not only has the absolute command of his own order, but directs and controls the general policy of the church. He is the power behind the throne and is the real potential head of the hierarchy. The whole machine is under the strictest rules of military discipline. The whole thought and will of this machine to plan, propose, and execute is found in its head. There is no independence of thought or of action in its subordinate parts. Implicit and unquestioning obedience to the orders of superiors in authority is the sworn duty of the priesthood of every grade, just as is the duty of officers in the army, and as much the duty of the laity to their priests as it is of the rank and file in an army to their immediate commanders. There is a complete chain of responsibility extending from the head all the way down to the membership. Thus, the whole vast organization can be wielded as a unit to accomplish the plans and purposes of its head. The priest is virtually an intellectual slave to his bishop, the bishop to his archbishop, and he's again to the cardinals, and all finally to the popes. White and black, the Jesuit superior general ruling not only the company, but the pope, the hierarchy, and the entire papal system. The Jesuit plans with the utmost art and cunning, unhampered by any moral restraints, and always with the utmost secrecy, and carries out his plans in the dark. We think, however, that in this case we have succeeded in tracing him through all the devious wanderings of his dark and slimy path, and in fixing upon him the responsibility for the assassination of President Lincoln. Our inquiry then thus far has established the fact that 5 of the conspirators were members of the Roman Catholic Church, and these 5 were its leaders to whom the execution of the plot had been confided. We have also seen that their meeting place or council chamber in Washington, whilst engaged in perfecting their arrangements for the assassinations that had been determined upon, was a dwelling place and under control of Miss Mary Surratt and John H. Surratt, her son, both of whom were zealous slaves of the Pope and clearly proven by the evidence given before the military commission and by that given 2 years later on the trial of John H. Surratt in a civil court to have been leading and active members of the conspiracy. One of these priests, having testified as to the Christian character of Mary Surratt, Father Widget, Jesuit Bernardine F. Widget, was Mary Surratt's pastor during all this time and testified that he knew her well, but did not know if she was loyal to the Northern Union or disloyal. This would seem to be very doubtful testimony, as Father Widget was noted for his disloyalty. The Jesuits working within both factions of the war, while the Black Popes, Roman hierarchy led by Pope Pius IX, was ordered to openly ally itself with the leaders of the Southern Confederacy, with which treasonous Confederate leaders the hierarchy had secretly collaborated in purposing to lose the war and thereby use the Republican armies to destroy white Protestant Southern civilization. The same policy would be followed during the Order's second 30 years, 1914 to 1945, in the destruction of Protestant Prussia and Old Catholic Bavaria. The Roman hierarchy, led by Pope Pius XII, openly allying via concordat with the leaders of the Nazi Third Reich, with which treasonous Nazi leaders the hierarchy had secretly collaborated in purposing to lose the war and thereby use the Allied armies to destroy Protestant Prussian and anti-Vatican, anti-papal infallibility Old Catholic German civilization. He said he had become acquainted with her through having had the care of 2 of his sons as his pupils. One of these was serving in a rebel army, and the other, John H. Surratt, had been a rebel emissary and spy for 3 years, passing back and forth between Washington and Richmond, and from Richmond to Canada and back as a bearer of dispatches. And yet the Jesuitical priest endeavored to shape his testimony as to leave the impression that the topics of conversation between himself and Mrs. Surratt, whilst all this was going on, and much more, was confined to such topics as the state of her health, the weather, etc. We cannot help thinking that all of these holy or unholy fathers testified on the well understood mental reservations of the Jesuits. Father Widget was, as we have said, her pastor, and so we take it was a confessor. We cannot think it at all probable that she would have engaged in a conspiracy fraught with so much danger to her and such grave consequences hereafter without having confided to him her terrible secret, nor without his approval. It certainly is rather strange that she should have broken her relations with him after her conviction and taken non-Jesuit Father Jacob A. Walter for her confessor and spiritual guide in her preparation for death. There must have been a grave reason for this change, and it was made for her by these Jesuit priests for some important reason. It is not at all likely that at such a time, under such solemn circumstances, she would have made this change from a pastor to another priest with whom she had not had any previous acquaintance of her own volition. Had she been innocent, her trusted pastor would have been the one to whom she naturally would have looked for consolation. But Widget had no doubt told her that she would incur no guilt in aiding the conspiracy, and so to Walter she could declare her innocence, having the faith of a Catholic in Widget's power to grant her a dispensation. There was to be a great effort made to get a commutation or reversal of her sentence, and the strong plea of the father was to be based on his assertion of her innocence. Failing in this, Father Walter for 30 years persisted in his efforts to fix upon the government the stigma of having murdered an innocent woman. We now come to the trial of John H. Surratt before a civil court. The hand of the Jesuit is everywhere traceable throughout the history of this trial, and by that hand, one of the most important trials that The history of American jurisprudence recourse was well nigh turned into a farce by the skill and cunning of the defense. The cunning of the Jesuit was exercised in the preparations made in advance to make sure of acquittal of the accused. The law of Congress, specifying particularly how juries to try cases in the criminal court in the District of Columbia should be secured, was entirely ignored. In some of its most important essential particulars, counsel for the defense had been selected with special care. There were 3 of these: Mr. Merrick and the 2 Bradleys, senior and junior. Of these, only one, Mr. Merrick, was a member of the Roman Catholic Church. A jury was finally obtained through a 2 days effort, and as the prosecution desired to remove as far as possible all religious and political considerations and influences from the trial, a considerable number of Roman Catholics were accepted on this jury. The trial then proceeded. The result was a hung jury. The author was informed by a very intelligent man that took a prominent part in this trial that meeting one of the jurors who appeared to be a very frank and intelligent man. The day after the trial, he asked him if he felt free to tell how the jury stood. He replied that they were nearly equally divided for conviction and acquittal. He then asked him if they did not think that he was proven guilty. "Oh, yes," he replied. "We thought he was proven guilty, but we thought his conviction would be a triumph for the Republican radicals, and we thought that the hanging of his mother, Mary Surratt, was about enough." Thomas M. Harris, 1897. Talleyrand, one of the most celebrated Roman Catholic bishops of France, once said, "Language is the art of concealing one's thoughts. Never was there a true expression, if it had a reference to the awful deceptions practiced by the Church of Rome under the pompous name of theological studies." The principal theologians which we had in our hands were Les Conferences d'Anger, Bailly, Peter, Dens, St. Thomas Aquinas, but above all Alfonso Liguori, who has since been canonized. Never did I open one without offering up a fervent prayer to God and to the Virgin Mary for the light and grace of which I would be in need for myself and for the people whose pastor I was to become. But how shall I relate my surprise when I discovered that in order to accept the principles of the theologians which my church gave me for guides, I had to put away all principles of truth, of justice, of honor and holiness. What long and painful efforts it cost me to extinguish one by one the lights of truth and of reason kindled by the hands of my merciful God in my intelligence. For to study theology in the Church of Rome signifies to learn, to speak falsely, to deceive, to commit robbery, to perjure oneself. It means how to commit sins without shame. It means to plunge the soul into every kind of iniquity and turpitude without remorse. These very men who corrupted my heart, perverted my intelligence, and poisoned my soul, as they have done with each and every priest of their church, will be my witnesses. I will just now forcibly bring them before the world to testify against themselves. Liguori, in his treatise on oaths, asks himself whether the accused legitimately interrogated can deny a crime even with an oath if the confession of the crime would be attended with great disadvantage. The saint replies that the accused, if in danger of death or of prison or of perpetual exile, the loss of all property, the danger of the galleys and such like, can deny the crime even with an oath, as did Mary Surratt on the advice of her pastor, Jesuit priest Bernardine F. Widget. Liguori asks whether a woman accused of the crime of adultery, or by logical extension of the crime of murder, which she has really committed, may deny it under oath. He answers she's able to assert equivocally that she did not break a bond of matrimony which truly remains. And if sacramentally she confessed adultery or murder, she can answer, "I'm innocent of this crime," because by confession to a priest supposedly possessing the Pope's power to forgive sins, it was taken away. Socrates, who however here remarks that she cannot affirm it with an oath, because in asserting anything the probability of a deed suffices, but in swearing certainly is required. To this It is replied that in swearing moral certainty suffices. As we said above, the term moral certainty having been used by Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade in describing the guilt of Lee Harvey Oswald as being the lone assassin of President John F. Kennedy, which moral certainty of the remission of sin can indeed be had when any Roman Catholic, morally well disposed, receives the sacrament of penance. The Roman Catholics have not only the right, but it is their duty to kill heretics. Every heretic and Protestant is condemned to death, and every oath of allegiance to a government which is Protestant or heretic is abrogated by the Council of Lateran. Catholics, including SS Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler, who shall assume the cross, the Masonic swastika, for the extermination of heretics, Protestant Germans, Orthodox Slavs, and European Jews shall enjoy the same indulgences and be protected by the same privileges, escaping the light justice through the Pope's Vatican's red lines, overseen by the Jesuit order, as are granted to those who go to the help of the Holy Land. I wish I had never opened a book of theology. Our theologians are without heart, soul, logic. Many of them approve of theft, lies, perjury. Others drag as candidates for the priesthood without a blush into the most filthy pits of iniquity. Every one of them would like to make an assassin of every Catholic. According to their doctrine, Christ is nothing but a Corsican brigand whose bloodthirsty disciples are bound to destroy all the heretics with fire and sword. Were we acting according to the principles of those theologians, we would slaughter all Protestants and Jews with the same coolness of blood as we would shoot down the wolf which crosses our path. With their hands still reddened with the blood of St. Bartholomew, they speak to us of charity, religion, and God, as if there were neither of them in the world, the priesthood being, in fact, practical atheism. But why let my memory and my thoughts linger any longer in these frightful paths? Here murderers, liars, perjurers, and thieves are assured by the theologians of the Church of Rome that they can lie, steal, murder, and perjure themselves as much as they like without offending God, provided they commit those crimes according to certain rules approved by the Pope for the good of the Church. Charles Chiniquy, 1886. John Harrison Surratt Jr., the 19-year-old son of Mrs. Mary Surratt, who was chosen by the Jesuits as the arch-conspirator in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, had studied 3 years in preparation for the Roman priesthood at the Sulpician Fathers Monastery at Charles County, Maryland, previous to the breaking out of the Civil War. The Sulpician Fathers is a branch of the Jesuit order. That John Harrison Surratt was cool, clever, calculating, and crafty far in advance of his years is shown by the fact that at the very beginning of the rebellion he was selected to do important work in the Southern Secret Service, bearing the most important dispatches from Jefferson Davis, educated in Kentucky by Dominicans at St. Thomas College, Father Wallace, in particular, who later became the Bishop of Nashville, at Richmond, to his agents, including Freemason Edwin M. Stanton's War Department in control of federal generals of the field, and to the members of his kitchen cabinet in Montreal, Canada, Montreal being the Jesuit nursery and powerhouse for all of North America. When Mr. Davis had been arrested after the close of the Civil War and was to be tried for treason, it was the distinguished Catholic attorney Charles O'Connor of New York City who offered his services, which were accepted in Mr. Davis's defense, which defense resulted in the case being dropped, Davis dying in the order's New Orleans in 1889. This boy, for we must remember that he was but in his teens at his entrance into this plot, was never free from the espionage and evil influence of the Romish Church, from his baptism and infancy to the day of his death at the age of 72 years, when he was but 12 years old. He was placed in Gonzaga College, Washington, D.C., a Catholic preparatory school under the tutorage of Jesuit priest Bernardine F. Widget, who was the confessor for years of both himself and his mother. After leaving Gonzaga College, he spent 2 years at Georgetown, the Jesuit college, before leaving for the Sulpician Fathers Monastery. I'm calling the attention of the reader to this fact, that when you come to pass judgment on this young man, that you may place the blame for his conduct where it belongs, on the Jesuit psychology inculcated by the priests of the Roman Church. During Surratt's theological training, he had studied St. Thomas Aquinas, who justifies the assassination of heretics or anyone who apostatizes from the Romish Church. From the time John Harrison Surratt Jr. met John Wilkes Booth in Washington a few days before Christmas 1864, John Booth was a constant visitor to Surratt's home on 8th Street, which was the rendezvous of the conspirators up to the very day of the assassination. It was also the Mecca of the various Roman Catholic priests, among whom were the Reverends Walter and Widget of St. Patrick's Church, 10th and G Streets, of which the Surratts were members. Edwin A. Sherman, past Grand Register of the Grand Consistory of the 33rd degree of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry of the state of California, in his book entitled The Engineer Corpse of Hell, page 213, has this to say: "It has been told us, coming from what we believe to be the true authority, that Booth, about 3 weeks before he committed the crime, was admitted to the Roman Catholic Church and privately received the sacraments from no less a personage than Archbishop Martin J. Spalding himself, which he did to silence any conscientious scruples that he might have in taking Abraham Lincoln's life, and that he might have the whole influence and sympathy of persons in that faith in protecting and concealing himself when the act was done, to aid him in it, including the Jesuits and their foot cavalry, the invisible empire of Freemasonry." Mason President Andrew Johnson, who sent his son to a Jesuit college, was a friend of Jesuit B. F. Widget, aiding Surratt's escape by removing the reward for his capture. He certainly had that aid and influence in planning and accomplishing his hellish work and in making his escape. And it could not have been more cheerfully and faithfully rendered than it was, even if he had been a Jesuit priest himself. We believe this statement to be true, and that it was but a short time after that Archbishop Spalding received a donation of funds for the specific purpose, which was to uniform and equip a military body in the same manner and style as the Papal Guard of Rome. The uniforms, muskets, cartridge boxes and belts, all bearing the papal coat of arms and consecrated by the Pope, Jesuit-controlled Pius IX himself, were sent to Archbishop Spalding at Baltimore. And when he died, he was buried with military honors, and his remains escorted by the same military bodyguard. The entire diocese of Archbishop Spalding was rebel to the core and fierce in its hatred of Lincoln. Therefore, a Jesuit-trained Archbishop Spalding was the mastermind behind the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Even so, Jesuit-trained Archbishop Spellman was a secret power behind the assassination of one of his own Knights of Columbus, President John F. Kennedy. Miss Burke McCarty, 1924. Why did General Grant suddenly alter his plans and decide not to go to Ford's Theater on the evening of Lincoln's assassination? Who during that same night tampered with the telegraph wires leading out of Washington, said loss of communication being repeated in the JFK murder? Why was the president's bodyguard at the Playhouse? John F. Parker, guilty of the grossest negligence, not punished nor even questioned. Perhaps the most serious reproach against historical writers is not that they have left such questions unanswered, but that they have failed to ask them. The police archives of Washington Metropolitan Police Force afford no proof that Parker was really tried, though charges of neglect of duty were preferred against him. If any transcripts of the case existed, they have been removed, and even the eventual findings of the board are available only through subsequent records. These show that although Parker was tried May the 3rd, the complaint was dismissed on June the 2nd, 1865. The minutes of his trial before the board would make one of the most interesting chapters in the story of Lincoln's assassination, and so with a sly dig at the delinquency of his colleague in the War Department, the Attorney General of the United States, James Speed, placed the responsibility for guarding Lincoln, and by inference the failure to protect him adequately, squarely on the shoulders of Masonic Jesuit Temporal Coadjutor Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton. A bizarre incident on the night of April the 14th was an interruption of all telegraphic communication between Washington and the outside world, lasting about 2 hours. Within 15 minutes after the murder, wrote Townsend in the New York World on May the 2nd, the wires were grounded entirely around the city, accepting only a secret wire for government uses, which leads to all point. This information comes to me from so many creditable channels that I must concede it. Was it Colonel Conger who killed John Wilkes Booth, the crippled visitor of the Garrett household? Lieutenant Baker thought so one time, for when on the witness stand before a Congressional Investigating Committee, he testified as follows: "I supposed at the time that Conger shot him, and I said, 'What on earth did you shoot him for?' said he. I did not shoot him. Then the idea flashed on my mind that if he did, it had better not be known, as Boston Corbett was later committed to an insane asylum for admitting he may not have shot the fugitive. If the cripple in the barn had been taken alive, his pursuers would have escaped all criticism, and one of the riddles of history would have been answered. Who was shot at Garrett's farm in the night of April 26, 1865. Now that Lincoln's incumbency seemed assured for another 4 years, grave misgivings must have arisen in the minds of the radicals as to whether he was really the man they wanted in the White House. In 1862, he had written to Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that for the power of regulating the state institution of slavery, having never been expressly delegated to any branch of the federal government by its creator, the U.S. Constitution. The radicals could not regard the sentiments of the chief executive as anything but treason to his party. But Lincoln soon put a new fear into the hearts of the radicals, and one that made them almost forget the problem of slavery. The Wade Davis Manifesto had made it clear that Congress meant to deal with the problem of Reconstruction without interference from the White House. The president, on the other hand, still anxious to abide by the half-forgotten resolution of 1861, was determined to restore all civil and political rights to the Confederate States immediately upon their return into the non-14th Amendment Union. He therefore decided on a shrewd move. He arranged matters so that the generals in the fields should conclude an armistice that practically amounted to peace without penalties. And so, on March 27, 1865, Lincoln went to meet Grant Sherman and Admiral Porter in the cabin of the River Queen. There he gave secret orders to his military leaders. The orders were, in short, to grant to the opponents at the proper time a truce that embraced the formula of peace on the basis of the situation as it had existed before the outbreak of the war, thus avoiding the order's wicked reconstruction and the resultant creation of the order's Masonic Ku Klux Klan, while foiling the imposition of the 14th Amendment and thus ultimate miscegenation of both races in the North and the South. By this time, the radicals must have been fully aware that Lincoln was determined to thwart their desires and to restore to the South its former rights, even if it meant the eclipse of his own party. Lincoln did indeed enter the vortex leading to destruction by making his gesture of peace, for the day after he had done so, death eliminated him forever from the political arena. So far as motives go, the radicals had a greater stake in Lincoln's death and expected more benefit from it than all the Southern leaders could have hoped for by any stretch of the imagination. Otto Eisenschimel, 1937, American historian. The American bloodbath begun in 1861 and ending in 1865 had been spawned in Rome, carried out by the Jesuits using Scottish Rite Freemasonry. The Jesuits, with their Archbishop John Hughes in New York, sat atop of the ruins of America's Protestant Calvinist Republic, ready to create their new empire with the 14th Amendment. New York would become the Empire State, from which the Cardinal would be the Archbishop of the capital of the world. Additionally, the Jesuits were ready to amalgamate the races with the purpose of making America a nation of color, reducing it to a priesthood in Mexico, Cuba, and South America. The radical Red Republican Party had served the Jesuits well in destroying the South. It had nearly decimated Jefferson's Democratic States Rights Party. Thaddeus Stevens, with his Roman Catholic mulatto concubine Mrs. Lydia Smith, had the Constitution further overthrew it with his Reconstruction Act of 1866. He also led the impeachment proceedings against the disobedient Freemason President Andrew Johnson. Rome, however, rewarded him for his villainy by baptizing him in the Catholic Church on his deathbed, just like Francis Cardinal Spellman's obedient Freemason President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been initiated in the Johnson City Lodge in Johnson City, Texas, October 30th, 1937. Charles Sumner accomplished in the Senate what Stevens accomplished in the House, and no wonder, for he had been a personal friend of the Holy Alliance's Prince Metternich and had the highest praise for Rome's Thomas Aquinas, even as the present black Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, the author of the massive Summa Theologica, since according to Thomas Aquinas, Pope Gregory VII, and canon law, it is no murder to kill a heretic, Sumner had no problem with the rape, the murder, and theft committed by Grant and Sherman's Grand Army of the Republic, riddled with foreign-born, bigoted Irish Roman Catholic bandits. But Abraham Lincoln did, even though he acted the tyrant, in wrongly declaring martial law as later determined by the Supreme Court, in keeping Maryland from seceding and in raising the Army of the Potomac to put down the rebellion. There's evidence that he had a change of heart. According to many, Lincoln was converted to Christ after viewing the battlefield of Gettysburg in 1863. He later joined the Presbyterian Church in Washington, had several spiritual conversations with his close friend and converted priest, our hero Charles Chiniquy. We read, "I will repeat to you what I said at Urbana, when for the first time you told me your fears lest I will be assassinated by the Jesuits. Man must not care where and when he will die, provided he dies at the post of honor and duty. But I may add today that I have a presentiment that God will call me to him through the hand of an assassin. Let his will and not mine be done. The Pope and the Jesuits with the infernal Inquisition are the only organized powers in the world which have recourse to the dagger of the assassin and murder those whom they cannot convince with their arguments or conquer with their sword. It seems to me that the Lord wants today, as he wanted in the days of Moses, another victim. I cannot conceal from you that my impression is that I am a victim. So many plots have already been made against my life that it is a real miracle that they have all failed. When we consider that the great majority of them were in the hands of the skillful Roman Catholic murderers, evidently trained by the Jesuits. But can we expect that God will make a perpetual miracle to save my life? I believe not. The Jesuits are so expert in those deeds of blood that Henry IV said that it was impossible to escape them, and he became their victim, though he did all that could be done to protect himself. My escape from their hands, since the letter of the Pope to Jeff Davis, who was vice president under President Franklin Pierce in 1856, began the work of erecting a Masonically designed bronze idol of the Virgin Mary, later hoisted upon the White House dome in 1863, has sharpened 1,000,000 daggers to pierce my breast, would be more than a miracle. Chiniquy then concluded his meeting with the president with these words: I knew the hour to leave had come. I asked from the president permission to fall on my knees and pray with him, that his life might be spared, and he knelt with me, but I prayed more with my tears and sobs than with my words. Then I pressed his hand on my lips and bathed it with my tears, and with the heart filled with an unspeakable desolation I bade him adieu. It was for the last time, for the hour was fast approaching when he was to fall by the hand of a Jesuit assassin for his nation's sake. Indeed it was, but why? President Lincoln resisted the policy of the Jesuits and the Radicals, for they sought to create a new government with a new citizenship via the 14th Amendment. Lincoln wanted the southern states to re-enter the Union, and with the same status with which they had left the Union. Clearly he, like Andrew Johnson, would never have promoted the 14th Amendment. It was this open refusal to promote the 14th Amendment for which Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson was impeached, although never expelled from office by the Senate. Being a Southerner, Johnson was openly against the order's anti-Mason Thaddeus Stevens' 14th Amendment, but secretly, Andrew Johnson, the open friend of Jesuit B.F. Widget, served the company by working with his Masonic brethren who protected Lincoln's assassin in obedience to their master, Shriner and 33rd degree Freemason Albert Pike. Lincoln's plan would have frustrated the purposes of the Jesuits in creating a new government with absolute powers. Further, the Jesuits and the Radicals sought to intermix the whites and blacks of both the North and the South. This would make 14th Amendment America a nation of color, thereby greatly benefiting the Jesuits, for the Jesuits knew that the nations of color, Negro or Oriental, can only be governed by the absolutists, be they kings, emperors, shoguns, military dictators, or tribal chiefs. The history of the governments of South African, African, and Far Eastern nations confirms this truth. And if America becomes a nation of color riddled with Bible-rejecting whites, blacks, mulattoes, Mexicans, and Easterners, as it apparently will be within 50 years, an absolutist under Jesuit control like Fidel Castro most assuredly will govern it. To the contrary, Lincoln advocated the separation of the races and attempted to repatriate the freed Negroes to Liberia, as Monrovia, named after President James Monroe, had been built for that purpose. The Negro policy of Jefferson, Monroe, and Lincoln was the same, and it would have thwarted the Jesuits' plan of amalgamation of both races. It would have disabled the Jesuits from using the Negro to foment continual agitations, resulting in the conferring of more executive power in Washington, ultimately justifying martial law as a result of a contrived race war. Huge lawless black populations would never have grown to such monstrous proportions, financed by the Jesuit New Dealers' socialist communist welfare system, as well as President Lyndon B. Johnson's supposed war on poverty. Black women would never have been paid to commit bastardies throughout fornication or adultery. The more illegitimate, fatherless, and lawless children they would bear and raise, the more welfare money they could receive in creating their undisciplined criminal offspring. The explosion of black socialism and rampant black crime would never have taken place, costing the American taxpayers over $2 trillion during the last 50 years, further destroying the white middle class while fueling the growth of the Pope's wicked social security numbering system, the forerunner of the number of his name, Revelation 13:17. These hateful, hostile, violent, and vulgar black American populations, who in the words of Ken Hamlin, a West Coast black radio broadcaster known as the Black Avenger, ought to get down on their hands and knees and thank God they live in a white nation enjoying blood-bought Protestant liberties, including the right to bear arms, would never have destroyed the country's industrious inner cities, turning them into vice and war zones, encouraged by the Pope's partners in crime, further promoting black gang wars, the white CIA, and the mafia, thereby creating the unheard of phenomenon known as white flight, national gun confiscation at the mouths of Senators Masonic, Charles Schumer, and Knight of Columbus, Ted Kennedy. The black cities of Baltimore and Philadelphia, totally over 50,000 vacant buildings. Further, there would never have been the birth of amalgamated professional sports glorifying black athletes, many of which would set the example of marrying white women, the ultimate status symbol in their socialist communist quest for equality, or in repudiating their God-given blackness, thereby outraging a multitude of unshamedly black women while refusing to perpetuate their race. The whole seeding pot of black racism and iniquity is given rise to a massive and murderous homosexual-led, vicious, white supremacist, fascist, Roman Catholic, neo-Nazi movement, ultimately to be used against American Bible believers and racial Jews when marital law is declared. This is why Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement was crushed by the tools of the Jesuits in the 1930s. This is why, when black leaders cease to be agitators for the New York Cardinals CFR, they lose their influence like Dick Gregory once did, or are slain like the brave Malcolm X. Martin Luther, Lucifer King, was also assassinated by the CIA as he deviated from his original purpose and began to oppose Spelman's Vietnam War. It was clear Abraham Lincoln, newly re-elected in 1865, could not be allowed to stay in office 4 more years. So the Jesuits, with the help of the Secret Service, as in the Kennedy assassination, shot him with their tool, a Roman Catholic illegitimate son, known as John Wilkes Booth, on April 14, 1865. Lincoln died the following day on April 15. Years later, the Jesuits would make a memorial of that day, for by April 15, all taxpayers are required to have made their annual confessions by filling their income tax returns with the Jesuits' Infernal Internal Revenue Service, IRS. Of the Jesuit hand in Lincoln's murder, we read, "I feel safe in stating that nowhere else can be found in one book the connected presentation of the story leading up to the death of Abraham Lincoln, which was instigated by the Black Pope, the general of the Jesuit order, camouflaged by the White Pope, Pius IX, aided, abetted, and financed by other divine writers of Europe, and finally consummated by the Roman hierarchy and their paid agents in this country and French Canada on Good Friday night, April the 14th, 1865, at Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C. Again, we read the words of our hero Charles Chiniquy, but who was that assassin? Booth was nothing but the tool of the Jesuit. It was Rome who directed his arm after corrupting his heart and damning his soul. After I'd mixed my tears with those of the grand country of my adoption, I fell on my knees and asked my God to grant me to show to the world what I knew to be the truth, that the horrible crime was the work of popery. And after 20 years of constant and most difficult researches, I come fearlessly today before the American people to say and prove that the President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by the priests and the Jesuits of Rome. Compare the last hours of Jesuit Ravaillac, the assassin of the tyrant Henry IV, who absolutely refuses to repent. Those suffering also the most horrible tortures on the rack with Booth, who's suffering also the most horrible tortures from his broken leg, writes in his daily memorandum the very day before his death, "I can never repent." Yes, compare the bloody deeds of these two assassins and you will see that they had been trained in the same school, the same teachers that taught them. Evidently Ravaillac calling all the saints of heaven to his help at his last hour, and Booth pressing the medal of the Virgin Mary on his breast when falling mortally wounded, are both coming out from the same Jesuit mold. The Jesuits alone could select the assassins, train them, and show them a crown of glory in heaven if they would kill the author of the bloodshed, the infamous renegade and apostate, the enemy of the Pope and the Church, Lincoln. But the key player in the assassination was a young Roman Catholic former Secret Service agent for the Southern Confederacy. Having called time outside of Ford's Theater during the president's murder, John Surratt escaped from the United States into Montreal, Canada with the aid of the priest, from Montreal to London to Liverpool to Rome. He enlisted in the Pope's Zouave army. Having been recognized by a boyhood friend, Surratt confessed to the murder, saying, "I have done the Yankees as much harm as I could. We have killed Lincoln, the nigger's friend. I've done the Yankees as much harm as I could. We have killed Lincoln, the nigger's friend." As a consequence of this confession, the old acquaintance reported Surratt's whereabouts to the American minister in Rome. Having been arrested, he leapt down a precipice, made his way to Naples, boarded a steamer, and escaped to Alexandria, Egypt. But there in 1867 he was arrested by U.S. authorities, bound hand and foot, returned to Washington, D.C. via the specially chartered U.S. warship the Swatara, and was forced to stand trial for the murder of President Lincoln. Chiniquy narrates Surratt's escape quite clearly. It is evident that a very elaborate plan of escape had been prepared by the priests of Rome to save the lives of the assassins and the conspirators. It would be too long to follow all the murderers. When Cain-like, they were fleeing in every direction to escape the vengeance of God and man. Let us fix our eyes on John Surratt, whose confessor and advisor was the Jesuit Bernardine F. Widget, who was in Washington the 14th of April, helping Booth in the preparation of the assassination. Who will take care of him? Who will protect and conceal him? Who will press him on their bosom, put their mantles on his shoulders to conceal him from the just vengeance of the human and divine laws? The priest, Charles Boucher, swears that only a few days after the murder, John Surratt was sent to him by Father Lapierre of Montreal, that he kept him concealed in his parsonage of Saint-Libar from the end of April to the end of July, and he took him back secretly to Father Lapierre, who kept him secreted in his own father's house, under the very shadow of the Montreal bishop's palace. He swears that Father Lapierre visited him, Surratt, often when secreted at Saint-Libar, and that the father, Boucher, visited him at least twice a week from the end of July to September, when concealed in Father Lapierre's house in Montreal. That same father, Charles Boucher, swears that he accompanied John Surratt in a carriage and accompanied Father Lapierre to the steamer Montreal when starting for Quebec. The Father Lapierre kept him, John Surratt, on the lock during the voyage from Montreal to Quebec, and that he accompanied him disguised from the Montreal steamer to the ocean steamer Peruvian. The doctor of the steamer Peruvian, L.I.A. Macmillan, swears that Father Lapierre introduced him to John Surratt under the false name of McCarthy, whom he was keeping locked in his stateroom and whom he conducted disguised to the ocean steamer Peruvian, and with whom he remained till she left Quebec for Europe, the 15th of September 1865. But who is that Father Lapierre who takes such a tender, I dare say paternal care, Surratt? Is it not less a personage than a canon of Bishop Bourget of Montreal? He is the confidential man of the bishop. He lives with the bishop, eats at his table, assists him with his counsel, and the bishop has to receive the canon's advice in every step of life. According to the laws of Rome, the canons are to the bishop what the arms are to the body. Now I ask, is it not evident that the bishops and the priests of Washington have trusted this murder to take to the care of the bishops and priests of Montreal, that they might conceal, feed, and protect them for nearly 6 months under the very shadow of the bishop's palace? Would they have done that if they were not his accomplices? Why did they so continually remain with him day and night if they were not in fear that he might compromise them by an indiscreet word? Why do we see those priests, I ought to say, those two ambassadors and anointed representatives of the Pope, alone in the carriage which takes that great culprit from his house of concealment to the steamer? Why do they keep him there under lock till they transfer him under a disguised name to the ocean steamer the Peruvian on the 15th July 1865? Why such tender sympathies for that stranger? Why going through such trouble and expense for that young American among the bishops and priests of Canada? There's only one answer. He was one of their tools, one of their selected men to strike the great republic of equality and liberty to the heart. For more than 6 months before the murder, the priests had lodged, eaten, conversed, slept with him under the same roof in Washington. They had trained him to his deed of blood by promising him protection and a crown of glory in heaven, even as Muslim terrorists have promised 70 virgins in paradise if they sacrificed their lives for the purposes of Allah, having been designated by them Masonic muftis, who was secretly subordinate to the Pope of Rome. If he would only be true to their designs, to the end. And he had been true to the end. Do you see that man fleeing from Washington towards the north? He has the mark of Cain on his forehead. His hands are reddened with blood. He is pale and trembling, for he knows it. A whole outraged nation is after him for her just vengeance. He hears the thundering voice of God. Where is thy brother? Where will he find a refuge? Where outside of hell will he meet friends to shelter and save him from the just vengeance of God and man? Oh, he has sure refuge in the arms of that church, who for more than 1,000 years is crying death to all the heretics, death to all the soldiers of liberty. He has devoted friends among the very man, after having prepared the massacre of Admiral Coligny and his 75,000 Protestant countrymen, rang the bells of Rome to express their joy when they heard at last the King of France had slaughtered them all. But where will those bishops and priests of Canada send John Surratt when they find it impossible to conceal him any longer from the thousands of detectives of the United States who are ransacking Canada to find out his retreat? Who will conceal, feed, lodge, and protect him after the priests of Canada pressed his hand for the last time on board of the Peruvian, the 15th of September 1865? Who can have any doubt about that? Who can suppose that any but the Pope himself and his Jesuits will protect the murderer of Abraham Lincoln in Europe? If you want to see him after he has crossed the ocean, go to Vitry at the door of Rome, and there you will find him enrolled under the banners of the Pope in the 9th Company of his Zouaves under false name of Watson. Of course, the Pope was forced to withdraw his protection over him after the government of the United States had found him there, and he was brought back to Washington to be tried. But on his arrival as a prisoner in the United States, his Jesuit father confessor whispered in his ear, "Fear not, you will not be condemned." Through the influence of a high Roman Catholic lady, 2 or 3 of the jurymen will be Roman Catholics and you will be saved. Those who have read the 2 volumes of the trial of John Surratt know that never more evident proofs of guilt were brought against the murderer than in that case. But the Roman Catholic jurymen had read the Theology of St. Thomas, a book which the Pope has ordered to be taught in every college, academy, and university of Rome. They had learned that it is the duty of the Roman Catholics to exterminate all the heretics. Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica. They had read the decree of the Council of Constance that no faith was to be kept with heretics. They had read in the Council of Lateran that the Catholics who arm themselves for the extermination of heretics have all their sins forgiven and receive the same blessings as those who go and fight for the rescue of the Holy Land. Those jurymen were told by their father, confessors, that the Most Holy Father, the Pope Gregory VII, had solemnly and infallibly declared that the killing of an heretic was no murder, the jury canonical. After such teachings, how could the Roman Catholic jurymen find John Surratt guilty of murder for killing the heretic Lincoln? The jury having disagreed, no verdict could be given. The government was forced to let the murderer go unpunished. Dear truth seeker, 80 years later, Rome's elaborate system of escape would be used again. On a grand scale, it would enable an estimated 60,000 Nazis, including high-ranking war criminals, to evade capture from Allied authorities. Many, including Adolf Eichmann, Martin Bormann, Josef Mengele, and even the Führer himself, would be secreted into the old Jesuit dominion of South America and enjoy the protection of a powerful Knight of Malta and absolute dictator Argentina's Juan Perón. Heinrich Himmler would be aided in his escape by the orders British SIS and Masonic King Gustav V of Sweden, while others would be spirited into the Middle East. Franciscan-led Croatian Ustashi leader Ante Pavelic would be protected by Francisco Franco, the Roman Catholic Freemason and Jesuit-protected dictator of Spain, whose successor would be another Knight of Malta Jesuit-trained King Juan Carlos of the old Bourbon dynasty. Carlos, now negotiating with Israel's Zionist leaders, pursuant to his title as King and Protector of Jerusalem, which includes the Temple Mount, the old Kingdom of Jerusalem, appended to the Pope's old Holy Roman Empire, composed nearly the same land mass as does Israel today. The cream of the Nazi crop, the SS, will be brought into the empire of 14th Amendment America to enjoy the protection of Cardinal Spellman, CIA, and FBI, overseen by his American branch of Knights of Malta. Upon Surratt's return to Washington, D.C., designed to be the Orders Roman, the Potomac, and military headquarters for the Pope's new Holy Roman American Empire, we read of the Jesuit presence during the trial. The appeals made by the eminent counsel for the prisoner to the political and religious prejudices of jurors was seconded all through the trial by the Jesuit priesthood of Washington City and the vicinity. it will be recalled by scores of people who attended the trial that not a day passed but that some of these Jesuits were in the courtroom as the most interested of spectators. This ever-present Jesuit influence gave John Surratt, a member of the Order's Knight of the Golden Circle, the present-day Knight of Columbus, characterized by the same merry worship and oath of allegiance, the confidence of his ultimate acquittal, that he, like Jesuit-trained Bill Clinton, was untouchable. We read, Surratt did not overestimate the protection of his church, for from the moment he had landed in this country, he was greeted and sustained by the priests of the church. When his trial began in Washington, June 10, 1867, the presence of Roman priests and the students from the Jesuit University at Georgetown and the Sulpician Monastery, being a branch of the Jesuit order, where he had studied 3 years for the priesthood, were the most noticeable features of the sessions. Although he declared himself bankrupt, he was furnished the services of the best New York lawyers. When it became necessary to furnish bail for his final release, it was immediately presented by an Irish woman he did not even know, to the amount of $30,000. According to press reports, this stood there until his death in 1916. That is some friendship, is it not? Dear truth seeker, the Jesuit order gets away with murder today just as it did in 1867. 100 years later, CIA agent Clay L. Shaw would be tried for the murder of John F. Kennedy. Shaw, like Surratt, was Roman Catholic. He also would enjoy the protection of the Jesuit order's powerful tools in Washington. Shaw, like Surratt, enjoyed the benefit of a hung jury, and he, like Lincoln's murderer, would go free. 30 years later, President Bill Clinton would be impeached. This Georgetown graduate and darling of the Jesuits would refuse to resign. He would be tried in the Senate, knowing full well his protection from the Society of Jesus and control of the CFR, FBI, CIA, the Secret Service, and the Mafia. The author predicted that he, like Shaw and Surratt, would never be convicted of his crimes. As it turned out, one of the senators who voted to acquit Clinton was none other than Spelly's evil Jew of the Kennedy assassination, Senator Arlen Specter, a Scottish Rite Shriner and 33rd degree Freemason, according to most informative and vast website freemasonwatch.freepressfreespeech.com, had been the junior counsel of the Warren Commission, who concocted the magic single bullet theory upon the Warren Report rested its case. These are irrefutable examples of the power, the absolute power in 14th Amendment America, exercised by the Jesuits through the Archbishop of New York, presently Edward Cardinal Egan. Lastly, certain high-level Freemasons were used to stifle the capture of John H. Surratt. There were President Andrew Johnson, whose son was educated by Jesuits and whose daughter was educated by nuns and converted to Catholicism, and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, who oversaw the project of placing a statue of Rome's Virgin Mary Persephone atop of the Capitol dome. With the knowledge that Surratt was in Liverpool, Stanton's War Department refused to make the least attempt to arrest him. A few weeks later, President Johnson revoked the reward for the arrest of Surratt, greatly increasing the assassin's chances to escape. A similar story is true of Booth, the fellow conspirator of President Johnson. According to the escape and suicide of John Wilkes Booth by Finis L. Bates, Booth escaped Washington with a password, a Masonic password. He settled in Kansas and died there, having confessed to Lincoln's murder in the presence of his presiding doctor. A confessed conspirator, General Lafayette C. Baker, who was later poisoned with arsenic in 1868, fingered Freemason and Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, who had hidden the key to Booth's tomb, barring any examination of the body. But if Booth's body was identified having been shot at Boston Corbett while the real Booth escaped, who then identified the body? It was a 33rd degree Freemason, Admiral George W. Byrd, USN retired, having been introduced to Booth by Naval Officer Fitch, the brother-in-law to Jesuit Thomas E. Sherman. In 1921 he wrote, "I was called on board the Montauk, a Navy gunboat, by Lieutenant W. W. Crowninshield to identify the body of John Wilkes Booth, which I did. Surgeon General Barnes arrived at that moment and probed the wound in Booth's neck. The probing of the neck wound sounds like the Kennedy autopsy, does it not? It is also incriminating to note that Protestant R.W. Thompson, who was another 33rd degree Freemason, contemporary of his Masonic brother Admiral Byrd, wrote the footprints of the Jesuits, extensively quoted in this volume and included on the enclosed CD. Thompson was the ex-secretary of the Navy in 1894 when he published his historical masterpiece. Byrd as an admiral had been Thompson's subordinate prior to 1894. Nowhere in Thompson's 500-page volume does he implicate the Jesuits in Lincoln's assassination. He doesn't even mention Lincoln's assassination, even though that murder was fresh on the minds of millions of Americans. Freemasons Edwin A. Sherman and Charles Chiniquy had exposed the Jesuit hand in 1883 and 1886, and why does Thompson silently pass by the Lincoln assassination? Because if the Jesuits were to be blamed, that guilt would also surely lead to the door of 33rd degree Freemasonry. As a result, the Jesuits would have been expelled from the United States, and thousands of patriotic Americans would have abandoned the Masonic Lodge in horror and disgust. But as in the Kennedy assassination, so the Sons of Loyola went unpunished for assassinating Lincoln, maintaining a successful cover-up through the years with their prostitute press, manned by the Orders Council of Foreign Relations in New York. Barring the martyrdoms of Jesus Christ and Joan of Arc, the methods used in Abraham Lincoln's assassination will stand preeminent in point of malice and cruelty, and strange as it may seem, the same diabolical cunning which nerved the hand of the assassin has pursued Lincoln beyond the grave and has been largely successful in hiding from the public all the details of his physical destruction, a crime in the eye of the writer which almost outstrips the first by this conspiracy of silence on his death, the youth of America being deprived of the knowledge of the details of the greatest tragedy in our country's history. Years later, in 1916, the Jesuits honored John H. Surratt, Lincoln's real assassin, with a special funeral. Emmett McLaughlin, one of our heroes, tells us, a student at Georgetown University, writing a biased whitewash of the role of the church in the entire Surratt case, described the funeral as being a solemn high requiem mass. It was indeed a fitting end and a final and significant touch. For as every priest and many observant laymen know, solemn high requiem mass with 3 priests officiating, that is what the word means, is usually reserved for the funerals of bishops, priests, and nuns. When it is chanted at funeral services of a layman, it is a token of recognition and appreciation for exceptional devotion or distinguished service to the church. It was done for George Harrison Surratt. It must have been deserved. Both brotherhoods, the Jesuits and the Black Pope's Masonic Invisible Empire, overseen by select high-level 33rd degree Freemasons, worked together as they had in the past. And as they would in the future, they carried out the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, the Second French Revolution of 1848, the Crimean War, the American War between the states, the assassination of Lincoln and cover-up, and would carry out the Second 30 Years' War, 1914 to 45, the Cold War, 1945 to 89, and the assassination of Kennedy and cover-up in 1963. The Jesuits are now ready to use their 14th Amendment American Empire, commanded by Shriner Freemasons and Knights of Malta, for their greatest fear yet. With executive orders in place and a coming national crisis in the form of another terrorist event, the Constitution with its Baptist Calvinist Bill of Rights will be suspended, and martial law declared by a military dictator. The Black Pope's Anglo-American-led crusade will ultimately accomplish the destruction of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. America's CFR-controlled government, the Great Satan, will be blamed for the destruction of one of Islam's most holy places, third only to Mecca. The leveling of Jerusalem's 2 Temple Mount mosques will further incite the nation's hostile white man-hating black Muslims to murder infidel Christians and Jews in accordance with the teachings of the Quran. This anarchy will further justify fascist mass executions by the Order's Office of Homeland Security. Then the Pope's dream will begin to unfold. The rebuilding of Solomon's Temple, designed by a Toronto Shriner, Jack Diamond, and the ultimate destruction of the American Empire with its heretic Protestants, pagans, and Jews. Pursuant to Peter Dent's Theologia and the Orders Council of Trent, the Truth Seeker, the next time you visit the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., and gazing into that sublime face, remember the President's words as you do your duty in resisting the devil's Jesuits. I know that Jesuits never forget nor forsake, but man must not care how and where he dies, provided he dies at the post of honor and duty. So here we have Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, 16th President of the United States of America from 1861 to 1865. Assassinated by the military order of the Society of Jesus, April 15, 1865. Fourth heretic president to be murdered by the Jesuits, including first President George Washington, December 14, 1799, the 10th President William Henry Harrison, April 4, 1841, and the 12th President Zachary Taylor, July 9, 1850. Joining the Republican Party in 1856, Abraham Lincoln had already proven himself to be a notorious enemy of the Jesuit order, having been the defense attorney for Roman Catholic priest Charles Chinnery, falsely accused by two priests sent by his cold-blooded anti-Bible, anti-Protestant Bishop O'Regan. Lincoln thundered against the nefarious plot calculated to destroy an innocent man, thereby incurring the wrath of no less than 10 Jesuits in the courtroom. In 1858, Lincoln engaged in a series of anti-slavery debates with Freemason Stephen A. Douglas, whose Roman Catholic wife was a member of Jesuit Bernardine F. Widgett's St. Aloysius Church in Washington, D.C. Using Senator Douglas to split the Democratic Party, the order guaranteed a Republican victory, sudden secession, and thus a northern war on the Protestant South. Upon his re-election after the company's Yankees War of Annihilation laying the Protestant city of Richmond in ruins, non-centralist Lincoln sought to continue the old state rights union by readmitting the southern states with the same legal status they enjoyed prior to secession, for refusing to back the ensuing Reconstruction Act and resultant 14th Amendment. Lincoln was given the leaden bullet. The illustrious life of William McKinley, a martyr president. Pope Pius IX, King and Papal Caesar of Rome. The Vicar of Christ and the King of the World, 1846 to 1878, promoter of the Black Pope's Syllabus of Errors, 1864. To whom every king, president, dictator owed his allegiance, and with the Jesuits as his penholders, this tyrant put forth the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception in 1854, decreeing that Mary was born without the stain of original sin, otherwise inherent in Adam's fallen race, except the Lord Jesus Christ. This heresy further exalts the Virgin Mary to the place of becoming the Mother of God and the Queen of Heaven of the ancient pagan Trinity. Pius IX, having advocated a revival of the guillotine to fight Protestantism in 1855, also condemned modern civilization, including freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, with his Syllabus of Errors in 1864. He then called for the First Vatican Council, at which the Pope was decreed to be infallible, becoming God Almighty on earth. His real crime, however, was given his American Roman hierarchy the order to assassinate President Abraham Lincoln, who became a usurper and a tyrant for refusing to consent to the order's radical, red, Republican-sponsored, corporate, fascist, socialist, communist 14th Amendment, Rome's coup d'etat, converting our Protestant and Baptist Calvinist republic into a Jesuit-ruled, Masonically led absolutist Holy Roman Empire. The suppressed truth about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. John Harrison Surratt, Jr., 21, a papal Zouave uniform in 1867, Roman Catholic Jesuit-trained assassin of President Abraham Lincoln. A member of the Knights of the Golden Circle and the weapon of murder in the hand of his evil Jesuit confessor Bernardine F. Widgett, John Surratt escaped the bounty hunters on North America through Pope Pius IX's International Vatican rat lines. 2 years later, he was arrested in Alexandria, Egypt, and returned to the United States to stand trial for the murder of the president. Aided and comforted by the Jesuits from Georgetown University, the jury was hung, and its obvious murderer went free. The Black Pope had won, thus assuring that more presidential assassinations were to come, if need be, including those of Mason James A. Garfield, Mason William McKinley, Shriner Warren G. Harding, 33rd degree Freemason FDR, and Knight of Columbus John F. Kennedy. And here we have the Papal Knight John H. Surratt at 72, just before his death in 1916. Like the Masonic Hunter McGuire, the Black Pope's murder man, who without conscience obediently obey in the secret dispatching of condemned liberals, heretics, tyrants, and usurpers, live long, prosperous lives. The vast and unseen power the Jesuit general can command is truly unfathomable, reaching into the politics, high finance, multinational corporations, and every religious creed of all nations. If the order is given to protect one of the malicious faithful soldiers, most assuredly that command will be obeyed immediately and without question. His kingdom of solipsism, seemingly omnipresent, reaches into every hovel of culture without the average man knowing of his mighty existence. Those who know say nothing lest they should pay with their lives. Only those whom the Son of God has made free indeed dare to expose what they know to be the truth. According to the brave Mrs. McCarty, the above is the last picture taken of John H. Surratt, who died in Baltimore, Maryland, April 23rd, 1916, surrounded by his wife and grown family. At his request, he was buried in his Surratt lot at Mount Olivet, Washington, D.C., on the left side of his mother's grave. He was the auditor of a large corporation until his death. Hark he shall awake someday. Lincoln Secretary of War Freemason Edwin M. Stanton, 1865. 32nd degree Freemason President Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869. Both of the above high-level Freemasons worked together in the assassination of President Lincoln. Subject to Jesuit Bernardine F. Widget, Radical Red Stanton, having deliberately prolonged the war via General Halleck, ordered General Grant not to accompany the President to Ford's Theater, thus saving his life. Arranged for John Booth's easy access in order to shoot Lincoln from behind. Presidential guard John F. Parker, having quietly vacated his post, secured the designated escape route on which Booth would flee from Washington, D.C., and appointed a cover-up military commission for the trial of 8 conspirators. John later revoked the reward for the capture John Surt and pardoned imprisoned conspirators Samuel Arnold, Samuel Mudd, and Edward Spangler. And here we have Jesuit priest Bernardine Francis Widget, 1821 to 1883. This is the human devil who, as a pastor of the order of St. Aloysius Church in Washington, D.C., oversaw the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. The master of Masonic President James Buchanan, nearly fatally poisoned in 1857 on the order of then Maryland Jesuit Provincial Charles Stonestreet, and Masonic anti-slavery agitator Stephen A. Douglas, whose Roman Catholic wife Adele was a devoted member of Widget's church. He was the confessor of both Mary Surt and her son John Surt prior to the crime. Upon Mary Surt's conviction of conspiring to murder Lincoln, she was accompanied to the gallows by priest Walter and executed. Masonic President Andrew Johnson, having committed his son's education to Jesuits, may well have granted Mary Surt a petition for mercy had her daughter been allowed to approach the president the day of her mother's execution. The 2 men who denied the access were later extirpated from the face of the whole earth. Preston King was drowned, found laden with weights, and Senator James Henry Lane shot himself, like Lincoln, not a victim of the Black Pope's leaden bullet. Between the Order's Holy Trinity Church in Georgetown and its St. Aloysius Church in Washington, D.C., the capital was now completely in the lap of Rome. Here we have priest Jacob A. Walter, 1828 to 1894, pastor of St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church, Washington, D.C., 1860 to 1894. Although not a Jesuit, Walter was the obedient priest of Jesuit-controlled Right Reverend Martin J. Spalding, Archbishop of Baltimore, defender of the temporal power and infallibility of the Pope, organizer of the Jesuit-led St. Vincent de Paul Society in America, vicious attack of America's Bible-reading Protestant common school system, and a historical revisionist of Protestant Merle D. Aubin's Objective and Honest History of the Reformation, 1840. Spalding also privately brought John Wilkes Booth into the Roman Catholic institution 3 weeks before Booth murdered the president. Walter, the pastor of St. Patrick's, was a co-conspirator in the Lincoln assassination along with his immediate superior, Jesuit Bernardine F. Widget. A frequent visitor to Surt house, he well knew the guilt of Mary Surt along with her traitorous son John Surt. Upon a conviction, Walter escorted Mary Surt to the gallows, and before she was hung, witnessed her lying last words, "I am innocent." Upon the nation's first execution of a woman, Walter declared there was not enough evidence to hang a cat. Until his sudden death in 1894, this wicked, deceiving Jesuit-trained Jacob Walter, in the words of General Thomas Harris, attempted to fix upon the government the stigma having murdered an innocent woman. In 1877, Walter's sinister new master would become the first American pope, the Jesuit-trained Archbishop James Cardinal Gibbons. And here we have the execution of Mary Surt with priest Jacob Walter, left 1865. Execution of Roman Catholic Mary Surt with conspirators, 1865. Thomas M. Harris, 1817 to 1906. General, U.S. Major General by brevet member, Military Commission, Trial of Conspirators, 1865. The Bible-believing, Christ-honoring, white Calvinist witnessed the proceedings against the top 8 conspirators. 4 hung, 4 imprisoned, 2 escaped, Booth and Surt, involved in the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Having authored 2 epic works on the subject, Assassination of Lincoln, A History of the Great Conspiracy, Trial of the Conspirators by Military Commission, and a review of the trial of John 8, 1892, and Rome's responsibility for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1897, Harris proved that sinister Jesuits and priests of Rome were responsible for the murder and therefore should have been prosecuted as accomplices to the crime. As a friend of Charles Chiniquy, Harris declared the organization of the hierarchy is a complete military despotism, on which the Pope is the ostensible head, but of which the Black Pope is the real head. The favorite policy of the Jesuits is that of assassination, but the commission was chosen by a secret co-conspirator, Freemason Edwin M. Stanton, at the command of another pro-Pope Masonic conspirator, President Andrew Johnson. Like the Masonic Warren Commission, the tribunal was not permitted to place the blame on Archbishop Spalding and certain priests of Washington, it supposedly fearing that a bloody holy war would ensue. Masonic Illuminatus Horace Greeley, 1811 to 1872. According to Alexander Stevens, a low-level Freemason and Vice President of the Southern Confederacy, Greeley was to President Lincoln the power behind the throne, greater than the throne itself. Having read the Bible by the age of 6, this apostate monster of a man became one of the greatest forces behind the orders British inside of the abolitionist anti-slavery agitation. A member of the Jesuit-controlled Columbia Lodge of the Illuminati in New York City, Greeley founded the Orders Jacobin/Radical Republican New York Tribune in 1841, dubbed the political Bible throughout the North. In 1855, he spent 6 weeks in Paris under the tutelage of Masonic Emperor Napoleon III's Jesuit masters after organizing the centralizing New Federalist Republican Party. He then promoted the Lincoln-Douglas debates, further inciting the Order's anti-slavery agitation. Leading the battle cry on to Richmond, he championed early and massive emancipation through no concern for the black slaves, calculated to destroy the industry of the Protestant South, and he opposed biblical capital punishment as mandated in Genesis 9:6. True to the Black Pope's new creed as perfected on his Paraguayan reductions, Greeley was a socialist promoter of French Charles Fourier, and his overseas correspondent was none other than a brother Masonic Illuminatus Karl Marx. In obedience to his Jesuit masters, Greeley opposed Lincoln's renomination for the presidency in 1864 and signed a bail bond for that slave of Pope Pius IX, Jefferson Davis, who in turn was never prosecuted. Upon his death in 1872, Greeley's funeral was conducted by another wicked Jesuit coadjutor, the apostate Congregationalist minister Henry Ward Beecher. Freemason Hamar Horace Greeley shocked 1877 to 1970. Present with Hitler at the laying of the foundation stone for the new Reichstag building, Schacht became the head of the Reichsbank after his predecessor died suddenly. As the order used the Illuminatus Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, to back the Republican Party, so would it use another high-level Freemason, Hamar Schacht, the friend of Masonic FDR, to financially back the Nazis. Schacht's son-in-law was the infamous SS Major Otto Skorzeny, a Hitler favorite. Socialist Yankeeism fathered socialist Nazism and communism.